Hello, today I'm going to be talking about the importance of color grading. Color grading is essential. It can bring your piece from mediocre to absolutely amazing. If you're a fan of this scene in the Minifilm titled, what was it? I think it's just called Spark, whatever. You're in luck, because today I'm going to be running you through my color grading process for that exact shot. That's my favorite shot, so that's why I'm using that one. Okay, let's get started. Alright, so let me just do a little bit of a disclaimer. This is more of how I color graded it, and it's not really a tutorial, although you can follow along. It's meant for more intermediate to advanced levels, so if you're a beginner, you may not understand this very well. So in that case, I encourage you to go look up some other color grading tutorials from creators who are much more skilled than I am. I'm not very good at color grading, but I try my best. So let's get started. Okay, let's start off by adding a color space transform. You don't have to do this if you didn't shoot in a log. I did. I shot an Apple log. I was using my iPhone. So I think the color space by default is Rec 2020. And then Apple log for the input gamma, obviously. And so now we can create another node. Press Option S or Alt S if you're on Mac, which I am, on your keyboard to create another node. And now let's look for the effect, Film Look Creator. This effect, it's pretty new to DaVinci Resolve, but I used it for most of my color settings instead of the wheels, except for the white balance and the exposure, because I'm using the log wheels here, which means that I can kind of fix the image because I didn't expose properly and I didn't set the white balance properly. Luckily I shot in log. Anyway, let's start with the color settings here, and then I'll switch between the two. So exposure, I brought it up a little bit to emphasize the warm look of the actual image, but I also am going to add a little bit here because to fix the exposure with the log wheels. And then the contrast, I didn't bring it down that far, but I brought it down a little bit because the Apple log profile generally makes things look too contrasty, but not too much because I'm going to add halation later, and that emphasizes the corners in a way that actually removes the need for a lot of contrast because the corners are already emphasized, but depends on what you need contrast for. And by corners, I mean edges of the objects. Like, look at this part of the tree. This is what I mean by corner. Sorry, it was a bit unclear before. Okay, now highlights. I'm gonna bring it down actually, but in log wheels here, because my style is kind of vintage, and in vintage cameras, the dynamic range wasn't very good, so I'm bringing the highlights down and the shadows up to emphasize that old feeling for the cameras where the dynamic range wasn't very good. Okay, now let's do fade. I don't increase it too much, but I do it a little bit because it just makes the edges of the image, actually more of the shadows in general, but here it's the edges, it makes it have less contrast, and that works well with my vignette, which I will add actually now just to so that you understand. It's already enabled actually, but I'll continue to increase these amounts until I need to. I think I did something like 403 and 480 at the time I was editing. Okay, now white balance. I changed that here because it's easier to do so in the log wheels. Here we go. I think I did something around here. Now you'll notice the image to really start changing into what you saw in the video, although we're not quite there yet. It also kind of brings out the natural halation, but I will exaggerate that effect later. Now, the tint. I made it a little bit more pink because of the overall image. Obviously it's green, it's grass, it's supposed to be green, but it can't be that green. It was a little too green, so I made it more pink. The subtractive saturation. Okay, here's a little secret of mine. I always turn down the additive saturation here, and then I increase the subtractive saturation and the richness. It, in my opinion, gives a nice look to the image, and it really brings out the colors in their most pure forms, which is what subtractive saturation does. I'm going to put particular emphasis on the yellow by increasing the saturation here. You can see the background, this kind of sky, changing, and I will make it a little bit more dense so that it doesn't look too bright, so that the dynamic range doesn't look too good for the vintage look. Okay, now bleach bypass, I did not mess with that at all at that point. I just kept it here at this setting, which is 0. Okay, now halation, enable halation. I still emphasize it. I turned up the amount. Radius, I didn't make it too high, but I made it decently high. I actually increased this a little more. Saturation, I kept this at maximum because I want to emphasize that redness, the warmth of the image. And now hue, again, to emphasize the redness, I just dragged it a little bit to the left, not fully to the left because that's too red, but right, it looks good to me. Maybe a little bit to the right actually, but yeah, that looks pretty good to me already. Those look nice. And now I'm just gonna do some subtle stuff with the wheels. Okay, so for the highlights, I again make them more yellow so that I can just bring out that vintage look. Midtones, I make them more red to bring out the warmth. And the shadows, I do cooler tone for the shadows because I want there to be a little bit of contrast in other ways. Not in terms of the lighting, but in terms of the colors, which is actually something I use in almost all of my projects. I'm gonna increase the exposure a little bit because maybe the dynamic range suppressing is a little too much. And I'm gonna increase the brightness of the overall image because I feel like it kind of looks a little better, brighter here, because that's what I did originally and it looked good to me before. And so that's pretty much it. That's how I color graded it before. This video, other than the intro, is probably not very well edited because I stuttered a lot, and so I probably just gave up midway through. So if you watch this, you are a true DaVinci fan. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Goodbye. Now I'm just joking. You really thought that